Before surgery became a science, before the body was a map we could trust, there was Andreas Vesalius, a young anatomist with a scalpel in one hand and heresy in the other. At a time when dissection was a crime and dogma ruled medicine, he cut deeper. This is the story of how one man challenged 1,000 years of error and gave us the human body as it truly is. Anatomy before Vesalius, a body of lies. Before Vesalius opened a human body, medicine believed it had already found the truth. That truth came from a man named Galen, a Greek physician and philosopher whose writings, crafted in the 2nd century, became the gospel of anatomy for over a millennium. There was only one problem. Galen had never dissected a human being. Galen lived in a time when human dissection was taboo. Instead, he cut open pigs and monkeys, and from their inner workings, imagined the blueprint of man. His texts were rich, detailed, and elegant, but riddled with errors. He described a human liver with 5 lobes, like a pig's, a breastbone composed of 7 segments, not 3. He insisted that blood passed through invisible holes in the heart septum, never realizing the circulatory system flowed in a loop. And yet for centuries, no one dared challenge him. By the Middle Ages, Galen's teachings were enshrined not only in universities, but in cathedrals. To question Galen was to question the church, the universities, and the natural order of things. Medical students memorized his texts like scripture. Professors lectured from pulpits while assistants dissected in silence, if they dissected at all. There was no expectation that what lay on the table might differ from what was written on the page. Dissection itself was rare, regulated, and steeped in suspicion. It required papal or royal permission, was often performed on the corpses of executed criminals, and even then, only within narrow time windows before decay made study impossible. Bodies were dissected more as public spectacle than scientific inquiry. In this world of rigid doctrine and theatrical medicine, young Andreas Vesalius was born. He entered the world on the final day of 1514 in Brussels, then part of the Habsburg Netherlands. His family was steeped in medicine. His father was an apothecary to the emperor, and his grandfather had served the royal court. Medicine was not just a career, it was a legacy. Vesalius studied at the University of Louvain, then the University of Paris, where he trained under prominent Galenists. There he was taught to revere the texts, not question them. But something in him chafed. He was a gifted student, fascinated by the body's architecture, but frustrated by the contradictions between what the book said and what he saw. Galen's descriptions didn't always match the human skeletons he could access. The rib counts were off. The bones didn't align. Then came the turning point, dissection. Unlike many of his professors, Vesalius wanted to perform the dissections himself. He didn't trust second-hand observations. He wanted to see, to touch, to learn with his hands. He began sneaking into graveyards and gallows, stealing corpses for study. These were desperate, dangerous acts, but to Vesalius, they were necessary. And in those cold, dim mortuaries, he began to see what others had missed. His dissections revealed the human body as it truly was, not as Galen described it. The septum of the heart was solid, not porous. The jawbone was 1 piece, not 2. The liver had 2 lobes, not 5. Every cut confirmed a truth and exposed a lie. By 1537, he earned his doctorate from the University of Padua, one of Europe's leading centers of medical learning. At just 23 years old, he was appointed chair of surgery and anatomy. It was here that his revolution truly began. He refused to lecture from the podium. Instead, he descended to the dissection table, scalpel in hand. Students gathered around. He became the first professor in Europe to conduct dissections personally, rather than outsourcing them to assistants. To some, this was scandalous. A scholar handling flesh, a doctor performing the work of a butcher. But to Vesalius, the body was a text more truthful than any manuscript. He declared that anatomy could only be understood by seeing, not just reading. And so he cut through centuries of error. He cut through the silence of the lecture hall. He cut through the veil that separated doctor from patient, mind from hand. His dissections were not just academic. They were performances, revelations, confrontations with truth. By 1540, he was preparing to publish his findings. not as dry descriptions, but as a visual and tactile guide to the human form. A book unlike any the world had seen. That book would become his masterpiece. But before we turn its pages, we must understand what it meant to break with Galen, to stand alone with a knife in your hand and the truth in your eyes, knowing that what you uncover could cost you everything. The young rebel in Padua, learning with the knife. Padua, 1537. The city hums with intellectual energy. It is a place where medicine, astronomy, and philosophy all collide in the candlelit corridors of one of Europe's oldest universities. And into this charged atmosphere steps a man barely in his 20s, carrying with him the bones of a revolution. Andreas Vesalius had just earned his doctorate from the University of Padua. At only 23, he was named chair of surgery and anatomy, an unusual appointment, and one that shocked many in the academic community. A student, a foreigner, a dissectionist. But Vesalius had a rare gift, the ability to both see the body and explain it, not in abstractions but in structures, systems, sinews. His appointment marked the beginning of a new kind of teaching, one that would turn the anatomy lecture into a laboratory of truth. In most universities of the time, anatomy was taught from a lofty podium. The professor read Galen aloud. An assistant, often a barber surgeon, performed the dissection, rarely speaking. The students watched, silently, reverently, passively. Vesalius tore that model apart. He descended from the pulpit and took up the knife himself. In front of his students, he dissected human cadavers with precision and reverence. No longer would anatomy be a dry recital of ancient texts. Now it would be a visual, visceral experience. He insisted on using fresh cadavers when possible, a shocking request. He bribed executioners for access to the newly deceased. He conducted dissections under armed guard. He kept skeletons in his quarters, assembling them like puzzles. It wasn't morbid, it was necessary, and the results were staggering. His students saw things Galen had never imagined. They saw how nerves connected, how the lungs inflated, how the muscles wrapped and layered across bone like fine silk. They saw the truth, raw, undeniable, and thrilling. With each lesson, Vesalius unraveled more of Galen's authority. In one lecture, he exposed that the human sternum had 3 parts, not 7. In another, he demonstrated the rete mirabile, a vascular network Galen had described based on animal models, did not exist in humans. These discoveries weren't just scientific, they were heretical. To challenge Galen was to challenge centuries of consensus. Vesalius was called arrogant, impious, reckless. Some professors refused to acknowledge his findings. Others tried to dismiss them as anomalies. But Vesalius had something Galen never did: proof. He documented everything. He began drawing his findings, meticulously, beautifully. These weren't rough sketches. They were anatomically accurate illustrations, rendered with Renaissance artistry. Muscles posed like statues, organs arranged like architectural blueprints. Each image was a statement. See for yourself. To produce these visuals, Vesalius collaborated with artists in Venice, possibly students of Titian. Together, they developed a new anatomical vocabulary, one rooted in observation, not repetition. This collaboration between scientist and artist would culminate in something unprecedented. De Humani Corporis Fabrica, on the fabric of the human body. But the making of Fabrica was not merely academic, it was a gamble. Vesalius poured his energy, resources, and credibility into this single project. He knew that the world of medicine would either crown him or crucify him for what it revealed. And so, over years, he dissected, annotated, and illustrated. He refined his Latin, consulted with printers, and coordinated the logistics of publishing a book so ambitious it had never been attempted before in medical literature. This wasn't just a textbook, it was a manifesto. As he prepared to release Fabrica, Vesalius understood the stakes. He wasn't just correcting Galen, he was displacing him. And with that came enemies, old-school anatomists, clergy, rivals who whispered that Vesalius was a body snatcher, a heretic, a dangerous radical. He did not care, because he knew the truth was in the flesh, and the only way to honor that truth was to share it, not in whispers, but in print. De Humani Corporis Fabrica, the book that changed everything. Venice, 1543. A shipment of heavy wooden crates leaves the press of Johannes Operinus in Basel. Inside them lies a bomb, not of powder, but of paper. A book of 7 volumes, hundreds of folio pages, filled with images so bold, so anatomically precise, they would shake the very foundations of Western medicine. De Humani Corporis Fabrica Libri Septem. On the fabric of the human body in 7 books. The work of Andreas Vesalius, anatomist, iconoclast, and author of medicine's most dangerous idea, that the body, not the book, holds the truth. The publication of Fabrica was nothing short of an earthquake. Until now, no anatomy book had dared to contradict Galen so openly, or so elegantly. With intricate illustrations and detailed descriptions, Vesalius not only corrected Galen's errors, but made anatomy a visual science. These illustrations weren't merely decorative. They were radical. The human form was shown in motion. Dissected bodies posed like dancers, wrestlers, and warriors. Muscles peeled back layer by layer, bones arranged in lifelike postures. The images conveyed not just function, but dignity. The body was not a cadaver. It was a marvel. The artists behind these drawings remain officially anonymous, but historians suggest they may have been part of Titian's Venetian circle, masters of chiaroscuro, capable of giving form to flesh and breath to silence. The result was a new kind of text, one that spoke not in dogma, but in diagrams. Each page was a direct confrontation. Galen's porous septum? Debunked. His theory that blood ebbed and flowed in tidal motions? Refuted. His insistence that the jaw had 2 bones? Obliterated by a single elegantly labeled figure. But Vesalius didn't just offer new facts, he offered a new philosophy. In his preface, he called for physicians to learn anatomy with their own hands, to dissect, to see, to question. The days of blind deference were over. Reaction was swift. Some scholars hailed the book as a triumph, a masterpiece. Others recoiled in horror. In conservative circles, Vesalius was accused of hubris, even sacrilege. To dissect a human was to desecrate it. To contradict Galen was to defy centuries of wisdom. Vesalius was no stranger to controversy, but now he had invited a storm. The church, though not officially condemning Fabrica, viewed its implications warily. Physicians who had built careers on Galenic texts felt threatened. Some responded with rage, others with envy. Despite the backlash, Fabrica spread quickly. Copies traveled to medical schools across Europe. Young physicians read it in awe. Professors copied its diagrams onto blackboards. Surgeons used its images to guide their incisions. For the first time, the body was being taught as it was, not as it was imagined. But for Vesalius, the victory was bittersweet. The more his book succeeded, the more isolated he became. Colleagues grew colder. Rumors followed him. Some said he had performed illegal dissections. Others whispered that he had desecrated corpses for pleasure. In truth, he had broken not laws, but illusions. He had shown the world that Galen was not infallible. That knowledge was not inherited, it was earned, and that no text, no matter how revered, could replace the scalpel's truth. Still, the pressure wore on him. He became more withdrawn, more cautious. His lectures grew rare. By the late 1540s, he left academia altogether to serve as physician to Emperor Charles V, a prestigious role, but a quiet one. For a man who had once held open the human heart for students to see, palace life was a form of exile. But Fabrica endured. The presses kept printing, the copies kept circulating, and across Europe, young doctors began to dissect, not to confirm old truths, but to discover new ones. Vesalius had torn down the temple. What would rise in its place was still uncertain, but the body would never be seen the same way again. And far from the public eye, whispers of resentment were beginning to solidify into something more dangerous. The church, already wary of anatomical study, had started to take notice of the man who dared to draw God's creation in pieces. Vesalius had crossed a line, and the price would be higher than anyone imagined. The price of truth, conflict, exile, and controversy. For a man who had just written the most important anatomy book in history, Andreas Vesalius found himself increasingly alone. Serving at the court of Emperor Charles V might have looked like success, power, prestige, the trust of royalty, but it came at a cost. Vesalius was no longer dissecting, no longer teaching, no longer free. He had become what he once resisted, a figure behind a desk, not a table. Whispers followed him. Academic rivals accused him of ambition, of arrogance. Clergy questioned his reverence. Some even claimed he had gone too far, too deep, into the human form. One rumor stood out, that Vesalius, while dissecting a nobleman's corpse, discovered the man was not dead. Panicked, he allegedly finished the job. Whether this tale was political sabotage or pure myth remains unclear, but it placed Vesalius under ecclesiastical scrutiny. According to some accounts, he was ordered to make a pilgrimage to the Holy Land as penance. Others suggest he volunteered the journey as a spiritual retreat. What's certain is this: Vesalius left Europe in 1564 and set sail for Jerusalem. He never returned. The voyage was long and arduous. Somewhere near the Ionian Sea, his health began to fail. On the return trip, his ship wrecked off the island of Zakynthos. There, at the age of 49, Andreas Vesalius died. The man who had exposed the truths of the human body perished far from the halls of learning he had once electrified. He was buried hastily in a foreign grave, without fanfare. No monuments, no grand tributes. For a time he faded from memory, but his work did not. In the decades that followed, Fabrica remained in circulation. It inspired William Harvey, who would go on to describe the circulation of blood. It influenced generations of surgeons, physicians, and artists. Anatomy, once cloaked in mystery, became a cornerstone of medical education. The resistance Vesalius faced only confirmed the magnitude of his challenge. He had not merely corrected errors. He had unseated an empire of belief. He had done what few dared. He replaced reverence with inquiry. Even today, some of his drawings are still used in medical textbooks. His methods remain foundational, and his philosophy, that the body must be seen to be understood, still drives the practice of medicine. But in his lifetime, he paid the price of being first. He wielded a scalpel not only against sinew and bone, but against centuries of blindness. And though his end came quietly, the tremors of his work would echo through every medical school, every surgical theater, and every moment a physician dares to ask, what if the old knowledge is wrong? He had walked the tightrope between science and sacrilege, and he had shown that to find the truth, sometimes you must be willing to be cut off. Anatomy Reborn, the legacy of Vesalius. Andreas Vesalius may have died in obscurity, but his ideas did not. Long after his bones were buried on a remote island in the Ionian Sea, his work lived on, not just in ink, but in practice. In every surgical training, every anatomical chart, every physician who reaches not for scripture, but for the scalpel, Vesalius breathes again. His great book, De Humani Corporis Fabrica, became more than a text. It became a threshold. It marked the beginning of medicine's modern era, a time when direct observation would trump received wisdom, when dissection would illuminate rather than defile, when the body would no longer be hidden behind dogma. In the centuries following his death, Vesalius's influence rippled outward. William Harvey, who would revolutionize physiology by proving the circulation of blood, cited Vesalius's anatomical accuracy as critical to his own discoveries. Without Vesalius tearing down Galen, Harvey could not have stood on clear ground. In art, Vesalius's legacy endured as well. The anatomical drawings of the Fabrica inspired generations of artists, particularly those of the Baroque and Enlightenment periods, who sought to represent the human body with scientific precision and emotional truth. Leonardo da Vinci's earlier sketches had been visionary. Vesalius made that vision a method. By the 18th century, Fabrica was recognized as a foundational text not only in anatomy, but in scientific publishing. The fusion of text and image that Vesalius pioneered became standard in medical literature. Today, we take for granted that a textbook includes diagrams and labeled illustrations. But in Vesalius's time, this was revolutionary. More than any individual fact corrected or muscle mapped, Vesalius's greatest contribution was epistemological. He changed how knowledge in medicine was built, not through reverence, but through rigorous questioning and direct observation. His message to students and physicians was clear. Trust the evidence of your senses, not the authority of tradition. This shift laid the groundwork for the scientific method's full emergence in medicine, and it placed anatomy, not theology or philosophy, at the center of medical education. In the 19th and 20th centuries, as medical schools became more formalized and surgery more precise, Vesalius was canonized as the father of modern anatomy. Statues were erected, lecture halls named in his honor. A crater on the moon bears his name. Yet perhaps the greatest tribute is quieter, carved not in stone but in habit. When a surgeon consults an atlas before an operation, when a medical student learns by dissection rather than recitation, when a diagnosis is made not by authority but by evidence, those are Vesalius's victories. But the legacy is not unambiguous. In celebrating his triumph, we must also remember the cost. Vesalius worked in a world where to question the old ways was dangerous. He lost mentors, colleagues, institutional favor. He risked and possibly lost his life because he refused to lie politely. And yet that courage seeded an entire profession, one where observation, doubt, and humility are not sins, but virtues. In the modern age, where diagnostic imaging allows us to see inside the body without a single incision, it's easy to forget the radical nature of Vesalius's proposition, that the body itself is a text worth reading again and again. In the age of artificial intelligence and digital anatomy, when precision can be modeled and simulated, Vesalius still matters. Because at the heart of medicine is not just data, it's discernment, not just technology, but trust in what we can see and what we must ask. And so, centuries after he opened his first cadaver and peeled back the myths of a millennium, Andreas Vesalius still stands at the dissection table, not as a relic, but as a reminder. That knowledge is not given, it is uncovered, layer by layer, structure by structure, question by question. He was not the first to cut, but he was the first to say, "Come closer, look for yourself." Andreas Vesalius didn't just map of the body, he redrew the boundaries of medical knowledge. In every incision he made, a truth was uncovered. In every figure he published, a myth was dismantled. He didn't ask us to believe, he asked us to see. And by doing so, he changed not only how we learn medicine, but how we practice it. In every modern operating room, every anatomy lab, every physician who chooses observation over assumption, Vesalius lives on. His scalpel may be at rest, but his legacy still cuts through the centuries.